I think one of our main goal is that this is a complex thing here with a lot of moving parts, a lot of history and context, but also a lot of opportunity and things we're excited about. And as our paper of record, we want to make sure, and you guys have been covering it extensively, that we have a chance to just share what's already happened, but I also would love to give sort of a preview of where we think and hope things are going, so that as things develop, there will be a larger sort of arc to the not the story, but there's a direction and a path that we're headed. And so as pieces come together, I always like to try to know where it's going. So we'd love to do that too, if that works. So in terms of sort of setting the table for that, to your question, I mean, I know we said this at the press conference where we stood outside and it was freezing cold, but this is a transformational. It's not even a project. I mean, it's like it's a community changing and really a reset from a downward spiral to a rebuilding and a hopefully a very rapid upward spiral of job creation, economic activity, and optimism and hope and just feelings of positivity. So we're really seeing that happening in a pretty rapid amount of time. I think the original vision actually traces back in a lot of ways to the Ulster 2040 work that we did, and we both I think always try to kind of keep this as you make plans and then you try to actually follow them. And so a lot of what we're seeing come together, and even and we print a copy just if any of us need to reference it, but a lot of what we see happening at the site really aligns with the vision that our 2040 working group put together, and we started that work before the pandemic. And so everything that we're doing at the IBM site is with that both urgency of now, but also recognizing it's a 10 and 20 plus year endeavor, and we need to know where we want to try to get and where we're going. So there's really two pieces to that. One is, how do we reconcile with the past and the history and the failures and the stumbles and the literal mess, and then where do we go from there? So maybe we can frame it kind of that way.
Okay.
And then just in terms of the bridge from the past to the future, we also wanted to sort of give you guys the preview and the exclusive that the actual official closing of this deal will be happening. Our goal is by the end of the month.
Yep.
So really in the next week or maybe into early April. So it's a perfect moment to sort of reflect on what got us to that closing. And a lot of the terms of the closing have already been discussed and reported, but this will actually make it official.
But you don't have a date yet for that closing?
We don't have a set date. Attorneys involved, there's just scheduling. But the target was March 31st, and so we're expecting sometime within a few days of that date.
Okay.
So a lot of the history, of course, informs the future and where we can go. So maybe we can kind of just start with that, and then we can go to where it's going.
That's perfect.
So we all know the 30,000 foot view of the history, which is 28 years of
rent extraction, really.
Yeah, sort of I think extractive
is
and
the right
damaging relationship where there was not alignment between the community and a developer, and that got worse and worse over time to the point that there were 8 figures worth of back taxes owed to county taxpayers. There's all kinds of environmental issues, including, of course, the most physical, visible manifestation, which is these asbestos piles. And then, there's still the underground remediation as well, but that's more the IBM side. But really just allowing the site to degrade to the point that any businesses that tried against all odds to make it work there failed. And it was not their fault. It was really Ginsburg's fault at every single step. So we started, really when I first came into office, to try to figure out how do we change that dynamic? How do we turn the downward spiral around? and it really came down to upping our pressure and getting more aggressive in how we dealt with the site, starting with taking control and foreclosing on the West campus, which we did in, I think it was like December of 2019, around. And then making clear that that was just the beginning and that we're going to continue to ratchet up the pressure. And that really changed Ginsburg's behavior, and made clear that that's the direction that this was going.
And not to belabor this point, but I think there's a lot of the history there that is the reason this property sat. And even though others had approached Allen over the years and tried to buy it, it was truly underwater in every sense of the word. Even in the latest phases of this, EPA had started to do work to stabilize the piles, and that was the kind of, I think, in a lot of ways, the last straw. EPA was going to get involved. The liens that they would place as they did that work would have really made it impossible to ever turn this site around. And you remember from the discussions that we had back in December, the tax liabilities on these parcels were about $12 million. The cleanup costs that Allen had committed to do and never did were about $7 million, which is where we came up with the credit amount that National Resources was going to get. But if EPA does that work, they then add their administrative overhead too. So, we're looking at basically somewhere around the $20 to $24 million in the hole on this property. And so I think that just is an indicator, it had come to the point where of no return, really.
Was Allen Ginsberg also facing the potential of prison as a result of the EPA?
So that was the other thing that we did to up the pressure. We engaged the EPA, who have been phenomenal partners, and they were able to essentially pierce the veil of all these LLCs, this web of LLCs that he had set up to protect himself personally and make clear that he was going to be personally and criminally liable for the environmental damage. And I mean, you never know what totally changes someone's opinion, but we noticed a stark change with that dimension in particular. And so all of that situation left to get just worse and worse and worse each year. The longer we let it go, the harder it was going to be to turn it around, which made the urgency even more important. So we wanted to move quickly, but do it transparently and with public engagement, which is why we set out a bunch of different sort of community meetings and discussions, initially in person, then over Zoom. And then we did this open RFEI process where we had dozens of different proposals come in, many from local businesses, a few sort of developer types. But when we got the proposal from National Resources, it was sort of the dream team, really. When you look at their record in the state and in the region, mostly in the Northeast, it's just, they deliver. I mean, they deliver on the promises, they work with the community, and they have success all over. And they were willing to take on a pretty literally toxic site. And, that combination of their willingness to work with us and then to take on that problem made us really excited. And then in their proposal, it was so aligned with what we shared as a vision in the 2040 report in terms of the sectors we were talking about, from healthcare to manufacturing and creative arts and film, and food and ag. And so that was really, it all started to come together. And so that then brought us to sort of the current last few months phase, which is the itself. So I'll pause for oxygen.
Just a couple of quick questions. Was there a change in, because this property has obviously sat for decades, Ginsburg did buy it, but it just sat and rotted for most of the last 20 or so years. Yeah. Was there a recent change in law that enabled the county to move on it, that prevented sort of the county from moving on it earlier in terms of foreclosing and being responsible for cleanup?
There was no change in law.
Okay.
We certainly had a change in our posture of being a lot more aggressive.
Okay.
Of course, you can't trigger foreclosure until 3 years of failure to pay taxes. But there were many parcels when I came in that were already in that status, and I don't know obviously why it wasn't acted on. But
Okay, but someone told me that there was something that happened that sort of was a change in the way the EPA or that the county would have been responsible for cleanup, that you were kind of let off the hook, that cleared this way.
I mean, that was always going to be a dynamic of any negotiation, was who would take on the environmental liability. And to protect the county and the public interest, one of our key goals in a negotiation was to bring in a partner that would assume that liability and not pass that on to the county. So getting the EPA involved and them really taking federal responsibility for the remediation before we even started doing a deal, that allowed us to have that level of comfort. Because the greatest risk would have been we take control of the site, we don't have a partner to invest the funds to clean it up, and then the county is sitting on the toxic mess. Right, but nothing changed, and that was really just great partnership with the EPA, creative thinking by our team, and we work closely with Supervisor Quigley. I sat down with him before I even took office to get his advice on this site. I mean, he's been dealing with this for a long time, obviously, and has his experience in this world. So his advice has been great, and so we drew on a lot of the lessons learned over the past and tried to not repeat the history.
So the proposal or the project as it's now envisioned, as they envision it, iPark 87 envisions what they're going to be doing there. National Resources kind of fleshes out the proposal. Is it fairly in line with what they had presented in their request for proposals?
Yeah, with
BOCES is going to be there. There's going to be a community college component. I know there had been some talk about BARD, but that.
Yep. Yeah, I think with some additional detail and flavor as they start to get their feet wet on the ground, as they understand what the space is, what it would allow, and what those potential partners need out of it, there's more detail that's coming along, and probably shortly after the closing, that's when we'll actually enter into discussions about the tenants. Site control is obviously the important step before you can get tenants in there and make whatever improvements those tenants need. And so the closing is really the milestone after which we start getting into all that.
Okay.
Yeah, and for the lay among us, I think there's the vision of the sort of sectors and industry, and then until National Resources has control of the site and there's an actual transaction, they can't really they can't sign any agreements.
They can't finance anything. They can't sign agreements.
Right.
So this is
that's why we've been keen to move it forward, but.
So
we have a general sense of where they're going, and I think I'm optimistic that very quickly we'll see really exciting news on who both specific tenants and partners, but also just aligning with the sectors that we've been talking about. But I don't want to get too ahead on the specifics what they're going to do.
So, but. Are there buildings now that can be occupied, or does the cleanup have to happen first? I mean, sequentially. Let's for the sake of argument and for conversation, assume that the closing happens on December 31st, as you had hoped. March 31st. I'm sorry. Let's not push it that far, right? I'm already trying to get into 2023, I guess. So what has to happen then? Do they have to come in? I mean, I presume there has to be remediation before they could even move somebody into a building there. I mean, do we know that?
To take one step back, and then we'll go to that level. There's also these dual tracks of the East Campus and the West Campus because of how they were originally dealt with in foreclosure. They've sort of been on parallel but slightly different tracks of the deal. So. The goal is at
Enterprise was west, right?
West and east. So, the west part of the campus, the county took control of back in 2019. Well, started to, and then actually took control in 2020. The east campus, the county really only controlled, or is controlling for a very short period, just to essentially serve as, well, the county controlled it for a very short period, passed it to the EDA. The EDA is serving as sort of the holding entity until National Resources comes in. So the goal, and I think we feel confident this will happen, to bring those two tracks together at the closing.
Yep.
So we'll have a finalized deal that, assuming the EDA board votes it through, on the West Campus and on the East Campus. And the goal is to have National Resources be driving, both of those. So the West.
Oh, that's something new.
Yes, that is something new. That's not finalized, but that's where a big part of what we're trying to do here is give you a view of where we think it's going to go. I think it's 90+% confidence, but until it's signed, it's not final. But
so, because the county had its own plans for Enterprise West.
Well, and so we still do, and I think it'll look a little bit different. It's not going to be a sale on the West Campus. The county's going to maintain control and probably sign a long-term lease with National Resources on the West Campus, and then on the East it will be a full transaction. But to your original question about where we could immediately start bringing in tenants, the West Campus is much more sort of in shape to do that. The East is really, other than that front sort of iconic clock tower building. Is that building?
Yep.
That's not
Yep.
one. That's 20 something.
23, 24,
Yeah.
25.
That's the only building that is even in some state of repair, where there are still a few tenants actually there now. But the West Campus will be ready to move quite quickly. So that's where we've been talking about bringing in some of our public sector partners, like on the workforce development and training side. So SUNY Ulster and BOCES, as well as possibly BARD. But there will also be private sector partners interested on the West.
Just so I'm clear, when you're talking about the west part, we're talking about the yellow part, or
both.
No,
both.
the green is the two green parcels are the ones that we took in 2020.
Correct.
And so we call those green ones Enterprise West.
This is really the water treatment.
Yeah.
This
Right.
is just kind of like.
And this is the Bank of America.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yep.
Yep.
So,
This is like, it looks small here, but it's
Right.
400,000 square feet.
Yeah.
Right.
and
that's the
and
parking
by
lot.
the way,
20
which
acres of parking.
and this I think we'll see likely some stuff built here as well, new. In addition.
So you will recall that there had been quite some discussion about the county taking this property and what was going to happen with this property, and concern about this property being taken off the tax rolls.
Right.
And some level of assurance given to the legislature that in fact that this would be sold.
Right.
And now
Well,
you're saying it's not being sold.
Well, no, it will be put to use where a sale will be an option, but that it's sort of a lease with an option to buy. Our goal is to really make sure that we're preserving public interests and goals, especially at the West Campus. So we've put a set of goals and sort of deliverables that National Resources has to meet on the West Campus before there could be a transaction. We want to see progress. We want to make sure they're a good partner. So the West Campus, we have sort of more checks and balances, if you will.
Is this the
using,
area where there's that consortium that they usually farm to table, but it's like Farm Bridge?
The Farm Bridge is gone. The Farm Bridge is gone, but
No,
there's
the Farm Hub.
the
Sorry.
Farm Hub. There was Novo. There were a number
We were-
of other
we were
groups that
hoping
were
that-
coming in here.
Well, we were talking with them. We were hoping, and that was progressing. And then, essentially, those partners changed their strategy. We
Oh, I
didn't
see.
really change ours. We still feel that food and ag will be a key part of what happens here, both on the West and the East campuses. And the West and East pretty soon will be somewhat a distinction without material difference, other than the structuring of the.
So this
sort of
property is going
agreements.
to remain off the tax rolls.
No, there will be a lease with revenue flowing in and driving dollars, and they will be paying
Yes.
taxes.
Yeah, once the transaction is in place and there's a long-term ground lease, as the county exec was mentioning, that long-term ground lease will generate tax revenue for the municipalities. And then there'll be an option to purchase that. Once they meet certain milestones, they'll have the option to then purchase the property outright.
Okay.
One of the challenges we have, like with any of these things, is you're reversing one cycle and trying to start a different direction. There's some period where as you're changing direction, there's some friction there and some potential, and we're trying to minimize that window and immediately get economic activity happening that will drive sales tax revenue.
So why did the original plans for this fall through then?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't even say that they fell through. The tenants that had approached us in the first issuance of that request for expressions of interest included Farm Bridge and Nova Foundation and Farm Hub. And the idea there was that that was consistent with our ag, food, and beverage cluster, which we had recognized from conversations with the town would be a good fit there. And so we were happy to get that submission. In the end, Farm Bridge hit rough financial times, and just couldn't continue their operations. And Novo and Farm Hub were really looking to co-locate with a food processor like the Farm Bridge. And so they've reapproached us to ask if there might be some other way to work with some of this space. And they're also, I know, looking at some other properties that might be a good fit. So that's still out there as a theoretical possibility. And I think what is interesting and exciting about National Resources is that they also bring experience with food and food production tenants. So, we continue to hope that that'll be a part of the mix.
And you've had the conversations with National Resources, and they're interested in Enterprise West?
Yes. Remember, the first way we really kind of learned of their interest at all was through their submission of the RFEI for Enterprise West. That's when they first contacted us on September 16th to say they were interested in Enterprise West, but then quickly also indicated that they had already started discussions with Ginsburg on the east side. And so that's where these two tracks suddenly kind of started working in parallel, but as the exec says, coming back together soon.
And let's talk about Ginsburg since we're there. I know we're jumping around a little bit, but my understanding, well, let me back up, I'm sorry. My understanding is that there's 17 parcels involved in this new sale that will close on March 31st or thereabouts. And that there are still some parcels remaining that have not been taken for back taxes, at least one, and it has cell towers on it. Are there other parcels besides that Ginsburg is going to retain ownership of?
Yeah, so the first of all, remember the blue ones are the ones that were bought by another entity, Mio Marino, and are no longer a part of any of this transaction. The yellow ones on the east and the west side are the ones that were subject to the transaction. This parcel right here that's outlined in yellow is actually a little bit later in the foreclosure process. The proceedings didn't start at the same time as the rest of the campus, and so that's still in the process of foreclosure, and so that's not a part of the purchase and sale agreement that was executed in December.
But the county is foreclosing on this?
Yes.
Once the county forecloses on this, is that the entirety of the IBM complex?
Yes,
So
as a combination of the green, which is, as we said, already been foreclosed, the yellow, which is being foreclosed, including that which was a little later in the timeline, and then the blue that were bought by another
So there
entity.
will be no more TechCity properties out there that are owned by Allen Ginsburg.
Right.
Feels good to say that.
It does.
Well, then we don't have to use TechCity in the headline.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds great.
That's a good day.
That would be a very good day.
And this is in the process of being foreclosed?
Yes.
It all ties to that 3-year mark of what Ginsburg did, and we're going back again in time, but
that's okay.
he strategically paid his bills at the last minute on certain parcels to maintain the more valuable resources, essentially, including, this gets really wonky, but there's this master parcel, which is sort of like, if this were a castle, it would be the moat. It would be the way that you get in and out, and the roads, the parking lots, and the only thing he really dependably paid was this master parcel. So while he let the castle rot, he kept the moat sort of in control and preserved. But the moat is, the master parcel is no longer Ginsburg's. It will be part of this deal. So even these 6 buildings, for example, which we have concern about the folks that bought that, I know the community does, they are essentially surrounded by a master parcel that they don't control. So that's an important, it's sort of a side note to this larger discussion, but it is an important one, because the community still has some say and control ultimately in what happens in those buildings as well, if that makes sense.